Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 5th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan fired more than 11,000 air traffic controllers who had ignored his order to return to work after going on strike or enacting a labor sit-out over stalled contract negotiations. So just like that, the president fires 11,000 people, and 11,000 air traffic controllers did not show up for their jobs. Their jobs, of course, are helping planes get around, and so that's a big deal. It certainly slowed down air travel on that day, though maybe it didn't completely cripple the system in the way that the strikers had forecast and threatened. But look, this is a really interesting moment that says a lot about the power or lack thereof of federal workers, unions, labor, and the way it changed under the Reagan Revolution. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Niki, I grew up in a, pro-union household. People will be shocked to hear that. And I remember sort of like every once in a while, my parents and people in those circles just sort of saying, yeah, Reagan, broke up the air traffic union and fired workers. And that was like, a big moment in sort of the story of modern American labor. And then I also remember hearing, as people were on their soapbox and talking about that, sort of stopping and being like, wait a minute. How does that work? I don't get it. How does Reagan get to fire 11,000 people? So help me from many years ago who was confused and is maybe still a little confused, exactly how it is possible that 11,000 workers in a sort of random industry can be fired by the president of the United States.
Well, I grew up in a pro-Reagan household, so we'll get both perspectives here.
So it was like, man, that Reagan really took it to those air traffic controllers.
He really stood strong. Really fired those workers. The reason that he's able to do it is because the air traffic controllers are federal workers. And in 1955, the U.S. passed a law that said federal workers were not allowed to strike. It's at one of these moments that's both the height of labor power in the U.S., but also really a growing anti-labor sentiment is gaining power in the U.S. And so those forces are starting to coalesce. And in 1971, the Supreme Court says, if you're a federal worker, you can't strike. And these air traffic controllers are all federal workers. And so they know the stakes going into this. But PATCO, which is the union that they're part of, is also one of the strongest, one of the more militant labor unions in the federal government. And so you have this powerful and really emboldened labor union who believes that they hold all the cards, right? Because like you said, they tell the planes where to go. And so much of the U.S. economy relies on somebody being there to tell the planes where to go.
Yeah. And just to put a fine point on that, so you can have a labor union and that union can negotiate and so forth, new contracts, but it is a labor union that does not have that fundamental threat of a work stoppage, which, to my mind, I think is really that's the ace up the sleeve of any negotiation. And that's where the power is.
How else do you negotiate?
So, you have this interesting dynamic where PATCO kind of does all these things that maybe don't technically qualify as a strike, but they do sick-ins, where people stay home and call in sick, and they do other things to try and wield that fundamental power of labor shortage as they were trying to negotiate a good contract. And Kellie, they're trying to negotiate a good contract and benefits because, as we were hinting at, this is a really intense job that requires a very specialized skill.
It is probably one of the most stressful jobs you could ever have in the United States, or really in the world for that matter. I mean, if you think about the airways or the sky, there are no lanes, there are no stoplights. There's no if we think of all of the infrastructure that goes into creating sort of like order, and we talked about this with the speed limits on a previous episode,
right.
But there has to be that in the sky. And so if you've ever looked at one of those maps where it looks like 1,000 little tiny airplane icons on the screen, and navigating those two safe landings and making sure that none of those airplanes collide.
I feel like you're getting stressed.
I know. I'm
describing
just
this.
Describe something more calm.
You're ready to ask for a 20% hourly raise just describing this.
It's no joke. And maybe because, my husband's in the airline industry. He flew in the Air Force and still flies. And so it's nerve-wracking. And so when they're asking for, not just more compensation, but time off and certain provisions that would allow them to sort of decrease the level of stress that they have, it seems like this might be a reasonable plan to get better benefits. But all of this just backfires and in a way that I don't think anybody could have predicted.
And some of those demands are, more modern equipment, better staffing levels, work days where the shifts are shorter, there's more time off, which would ensure safety, and this happens in all sorts of different industries. These conversations about days off and turnaround times and people's sleep and rest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with these high stress jobs.
Yeah, all of that goes into play. People's lives are in their hands. Thousands, if not millions of people's lives are in their hands.
And 1 second of drifted focus and something could go catastrophically wrong. And so that idea of shorter days and shorter work weeks is about really making it safer, just like as you were saying, all workplace safety. But because it requires such intense concentration, it's a safety issue if they're working 12-hour shifts.
Yeah. So let's come back to 1981, and before we get to the actual showdown that we're commemorating here, I think there is some important context in the lead up to that about Patco and Reagan, who as we should point out, is newly elected president at this point.
He's a newly elected president who was supported by Patco in the campaign. And this might shock some people because unions are traditionally aligned with the Democratic Party. But Patco had really been at odds with the Carter administration. And remember, Carter, especially near the end of his first term, his only term, he was fairly conservative when it came to economic issues in particular, when it came to things like deregulation. And so he was in this kind of tussle with Patco. And Patco looks over at Reagan. First of all, Reagan endorses the union and its demands that it's making. And Reagan himself is the only labor union president to ever become president of the United States, right? He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild back when he was an actor. And so there was this idea that he was going to be, despite his conservative ideology, that he was going to be sympathetic to, if not the needs of all laborers and all labor unions, at least to Patco. So they thought they had an ally, which didn't quite turn out that way.
And that goes south very quickly. Just a month into his term in February 81, the new contract negotiations begin. Those stall out pretty quick for the reasons that we've been describing. Then we have August 3rd, 1981, which is the walkout, the strike. 13,000 air traffic controllers go on strike because they say that their negotiations are fruitless. The president of Patco is found in contempt by a federal judge, ordered to pay $1,000 a day in fines. This is really at loggerheads. So describe where Reagan's at now and what his move is.
So Reagan basically puts down an ultimatum. So he is not going to be the Patco ally in the administration. Instead, he chooses to look tough, which is something that is important for both his domestic and foreign policy at this time. And so he says, look, you have 48 hours. And if you are not back on the job within those 48 hours, then you're fired. And he makes clear that he's going to bring in replacements, air traffic controllers from other countries, air traffic controllers from the military, that he will do what needs to be done to keep planes flying and to replace these workers if they don't get back to work.
So essentially, Ronald Reagan fires 11,345 people and bans them from federal service for life. So not only are you fired, but don't try to get a job with the federal government ever again, which is extremely harsh. I mean, it was enough to be fired from your job, but to basically say you can't get rehired also puts people's pensions at risk, because when you work for the federal government, you have time in service. And if you can't recoup that service by working in another federal or government industry, you've lost all of your retirement.
And that's something that Reagan knows, right? Like, he's not choosing that just to throw something else on the table, but it's catastrophic for people because these are highly technical jobs. And in fact, when they first walk out, the replacement doesn't pick up right away. Like 50% of the flights are grounded. But when he brings in all of these different replacements, they're able to get it back up to around 80%. And so one of the things that happens is that PATCO sees that it doesn't have the power to break the airline industry, right? It doesn't have the power to actually bring about the stoppage that it wanted to do. And so now you have these workers who have failed at this strike, and now they have to go into other careers. Some of them move abroad and do air traffic control work there, and others just go into other fields.
Yeah, and eventually, a few years later, some are allowed to get rehired through a different union. And then in 1993, the ban on the remaining strike participants is lifted by President Bill Clinton. But we're talking about almost a decade here where a number of workers were banned from federal jobs. And this, to my mind, sets a number of precedents about how Americans start to think about labor. I mean, for one, this sort of draconian, not just, we're going to bring in replacement workers, but also we're going to ban you for life, becomes a bit of a template, and it becomes a tool that employers in the private sector begin to use. But it also, I think it is worth pointing out, and Niki, maybe we can talk about the sort of reaction in your household here, but, Americans generally approved of this. 59% of Americans at the time saw this move and approved. And so, does that approval, to your mind, strike you as the winds of change around how Americans saw labor unions were shifting anyway, or was this really a sort of moment that shifted public approval?
So, I mean, sentiment was shifting, and it had been shifting for a while, in part because union membership was so much lower, right? Part of the reason people support labor unions is because they see the benefits of those unions in people's lives, and there are fewer unionized Americans, and so fewer people understand the importance of them. So Reagan is capitalizing on something that is already happening, but then he metastasizes it, right? This becomes the moment when businesses learn that they can just break unions. It becomes a case study in business schools, right? Like, they study it so they can learn and they can replicate this. And for Americans, even Americans who don't identify as conservative, they see Reagan as strong. They saw that they saw the air traffic controllers as pampered. I mean, they were people who were making quite a lot of money because they were doing really difficult jobs. And so they were like, well, if they make so much money, why do they need to have more? Why do they need to go on strike? And so, PATCO doesn't just lose all of these jobs. They lose the public relations fight. And that has pretty dramatic consequences for labor more broadly.
I think it also showed, too, that they could get back up and running so quickly. I mean, 80% within a couple of days. Also maybe showed the federal government, maybe we have actually more than what we need, that if we can run off of this, how much less can we do with?
We should say, speaking of the wind blowing at their back, they were very, very lucky that those 2 days were days where there were clear skies across the country, right? Like, one of the reasons there weren't any accidents was because all the pilots could see where they were flying because the weather was so good during those days.
And that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so, all these confluence of small factors lead to this moment. But again, the legacy of it is hard to overestimate. Again, I'll just say, like, what's the opposite of a chilling effect? An emboldening effect, I would say, right? For a lot of private employees to say, you know what, you can be a bit more of a... I'm trying to find a neutral word, but I can't.
Is hard ass
you could throw. Yeah, I know. I was going to say bully. Yeah, you can be more aggressive. You can throw your weight around a little bit more in these kinds of negotiations. And I think when the president of the United States does that, it really does send that message. And it's funny. We think about, when you make the list of Reagan accomplishments and legacies and so forth, this maybe doesn't often make it, but I do think that it should be up there in terms of things, especially basically as the first major act of his presidency. All right, let's end it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
Radiotopia.